Hello, time for a Man and Great book review. And today I brought some props with me because today's book is A History of the World in Six Glasses by Tom Standage, published in 2005 by Bloomsbury. It's 336 pages. The title is something of a misnomer because it's not really about glasses, it's about drinks or beverages. And the six beverages that he talks about had a profound impact on the development of human history and human culture. The six beverages are beer, wine, distilled spirits, coffee, which we have instant here, tea, which we have a bag, and Coca-Cola and other soft drinks. Now, each one of these drinks was developed at a particular point in history and had a profound influence on the way human culture developed. So I'm going to give you a brief kind of summary of some of the high points of the book. Beer was one of the first, if not the first, alcoholic drink to be discovered by humans. As Standage points out in the book, beer wasn't really invented by humans, it was discovered in ancient Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt. These are two areas where barley and wheat grew wild, volunteer, naturally. And the early consumption of these grains involved grinding the seeds and then mixing them with water and then eating them as kind of a soup to get your carbohydrates in. And of course, if you leave these seeds in water long enough, they will ferment. Yeast will grow in there and develop and form alcohol. And it wasn't long before humans discovered this. The alcoholic beer that the ancient Egyptians and other Mesopotamians brewed back then was not nearly as strong as the beer that we consume nowadays. And so it didn't get them as drunk as some people get off beer today. And it did have one big advantage. There was enough alcohol in this ancient beer to kill any germs, bacteria, and parasites that were in the water. And of course, ancient Egypt, most of the civilization of Egypt was along the Nile River, which was heavily polluted, and so it was rather dangerous to drink, water, whereas beer was much safer because the alcohol would kill it off. Beer became so popular in ancient Egypt that it was actually used as a wage. Some of the earliest writing we have is from what is now Iraq and Syria. These were clay tablets that were basically accounting books, and some of the symbols clearly indicate beer. And so people were being paid as part of their wage in beer because it was stable. It was a fairly stable drink, and you could take it home and drink it. And so beer eventually spread from the Middle East to other countries and became widespread. The second section is about wine. Wine was consumed in the Middle East, in Egypt and Mesopotamia area, but only by wealthy people because the grapes didn't grow well in that area. They had to be in, so the wine had to be grown in mountainous areas and imported, which made it, as the book points out, about 10 times more expensive than beer. So only the royalty and the very wealthy could afford wine in that area. It did become very popular, though, in ancient Greece. Greece and ancient Rome were ideal areas for growing grapes. They still are today. You have plenty of sunshine. The soil's proper. They get just enough rainfall for the grapes to grow well. And so wine became extremely popular. The Greeks, however, did not drink wine straight. In fact, there was kind of a taboo on drinking wine straight out of the barrel. You were supposed to dilute it with water, sometimes by as much as 2-to-1, twice as amount of water as one. So again, it wasn't nearly as alcoholic as the wine we have today. But again, the alcohol in the diluted wine was able to kill germs and make it more safe to drink. And so it allowed people to drink safely and get a slight buzz, but not enough to become completely intoxicated. The ancient Greeks, being big on reason and democracy, did look down on people who were drunks, and people who drank wine straight were considered kind of lowlifes, and so you were supposed to water it down and drink it that way so you didn't get too intoxicated. But there was enough alcohol still in it to make it safe to drink, so you could drink that. Drinking water was kind of frowned on, and drinking straight wine was frowned on as well. And of course, the Romans picked up this winemaking trick from the Greeks. A lot of when the Roman soldiers would win a battle, many of the soldiers were paid in tracts of land, and they found quite quickly that growing grapes and making wine was probably the most efficient way to make money. It was the biggest cash crop of the era. But winemaking was labor intensive. You had to have people picking the grapes by hand, crushing it, going through the whole fermentation process, and that required a lot of labor. And so that's one of the reasons why slavery was so widespread in ancient Rome and Greece. They needed slaves to handle the agricultural work of growing grapes and making wine. Then we come to distilled spirits, like this bottle of rum here. Distilling was developed by the Arabs, by Arab scientists who were actually alchemists who were trying to develop gold. They were trying to make gold out of other metals, the classic failed, and it's impossible to do that, but they didn't know that. And alchemy, of course, led to the modern science of chemistry. It also led to distillation. They discovered in this process that you could take fermented alcohol and heat it into a gas, and then the vapor could then be condensed back into a liquid. And when you did that, it increased the alcohol content. Fermented drinks like beer and wine have a limit as to how much alcohol they can contain, because the yeast in the drink is what produces the alcohol. But alcohol's toxic, and yeast die when the alcohol level gets to a certain level, and then it can't increase the alcohol level more than that. But fermentation allowed you to increase the alcohol synthetically by heating and cooling the drink down. This had several advantages. Not only could you get buzzed much more quickly, the high alcohol content in fermented drinks made it much more stable. It was much less likely to be contaminated by fungi or bacteria. And this meant that you could pour rum and whiskey and other drinks like that, vodka, into barrels, oaken barrels, and it would store for a long, long period of time. And you could ship it on ships to long, long distances. And of course, this became very popular in colonial America. The number one drink before the Germans and the Czechs arrived with their beer, the number one drink consumed in colonial America was rum, which is made from fermented sugarcane syrup. Now, one of the problems with that is sugarcane requires a tropical climate to grow. And it's also, like grapes, winemaking was labor intensive. So what happened was a number of Caribbean islands, slaves from Africa were imported into these islands to work cutting sugarcane and making the molasses and the rum. And so islands like Hispaniola, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Trinidad, and Jamaica all developed large slave populations. Haiti is another one, of course. And there was a big trade in rum being shipped into the colonies. And the British tax on rum was one of the things that led eventually to the American Revolution and the establishment of the United States as an independent country. That and the tax on tea, which we'll get to shortly. So the development of distilled spirits increased alcoholism, unfortunately, but it also increased trade. And ironically, it was developed by the Arabs, who, of course, when they became Muslim, there was a ban. Islam bans alcoholic drinks, and so a good Muslim's not supposed to have this. Okay, so that was that. And then we come to coffee. So I have some instant coffee here. Coffee was also a product of the Middle East. It was developed in Yemen, we believe, first, and eventually it spread throughout the Muslim world, the Arab world. And there was a real debate at first about whether coffee was prohibited under Muslim law, because some Muslim scholars regarded coffee as a intoxicant. And of course, intoxicated drinks like wine and beer were banned under Muslim law. And so there was a real debate. There were some Muslim caliphs and princes who tried to ban it, and others did not. But eventually they came to the conclusion that it wasn't an intoxicant, so it became okay to drink. Of course, it's not an intoxicant, it's actually a stimulant. The caffeine in it is a stimulant. And eventually, the roasting of coffee beans and the process of making coffee was imported into Europe. It became popular, particularly in Britain, when the British royal family began imbibing coffee. And then there was a whole culture of coffee shops, coffee houses that sprang up as opposed to saloons. People went to saloons to get drunk. People went to coffee houses for stimulating conversation. Coffee houses became a location for scientists, politicians, economists, and other eggheads to gather, and they discovered that the coffee made them more alert, made them think more clearly, right? And so even today, business people will often start off the day with a strong cup of coffee to kind of wake them up, get their brain going. And then coffee, of course, eventually began to be imported in other areas. The Dutch basically stole some cuttings from Arab coffee plants and transplanted them to the Java, the island of Java in the East Indies, and began coffee plantations there. And the French did the same thing in the West Indies. They went to the island of Martinique, which was one of their colonies, and created a coffee plantation there. The Portuguese started growing coffee in Brazil, and the Spanish in Colombia and so forth. And these countries are all major coffee producers to this day. So the rise of colonization, the development of ships that were able to sail across the ocean led to the widespread dissemination of coffee from the Middle East to throughout the world. And something similar happened with tea. Tea, of course, developed first in China and then spread to other Asian countries. Japan developed an elaborate tea culture. The tea ceremony in Japan is very famous, and there's a whole elaborate set of etiquette rules that you have to follow to drink tea in traditional tea drinking in Japan. The tea, again, the Dutch East India Company was one of the first companies to get hold of tea and began creating plantations. The British, of course, also got involved. The black tea, which this is, was particularly popular with the British because it kept longer on sea voyages without spoiling, and it became a huge deal. As the book points out, in 1700, hardly anybody in England drank tea. By the end of the 1700s, by 1800, almost everyone did. So it was a huge social revolution, tea drinking. One of the advantages of tea, aside from the fact that it wasn't alcoholic, didn't make you groggy or stoned, it was also much cheaper than beer and wine, and widely available thanks to the British Empire's importation of tea. And again, tea became very popular also in the American colonies. And again, when the British tried to put a major tax on the importation of tea, it led to a revolt. And of course, the famous Boston Tea Party, where American colonists disguised themselves not very convincingly as Indians, and then attacked a British ship and threw all the tea barrels into the harbor, ruining thousands of dollars worth of valuable tea, and laying the groundwork for the American Revolution. And then the final drink is Coca-Cola and other soft drinks. Now, Coke and these other soft drinks are associated, of course, with the United States. But ironically, soft drinks really were invented in Europe. In fact, there's been a long history of Europeans drinking carbonated water, seltzer water, or sparkling water as a medicine. There's several springs in France where the water is naturally fermented from underground, carbonated naturally, and people would drink this thinking that it would cure all kinds of diseases and lead to great health. And it wasn't long before people realized you could add flavorings to this carbonated water and sugar and so forth and create soft drinks. But the soft drink industry really took off in the United States, particularly in the American South. All of the major soft drink brands that we're familiar with, Coke, Pepsi, Dr. Pepper, and so forth, Royal Crown, they all began in the American South. And it makes sense when you think about it because a lot of American Protestant denominations in the South were very much anti-alcohol. They were temperance religions, temperance denominations. And so there was a big taboo about drinking, and so they turned to drinking these as well. Coke, like all these other soft drinks, really started out as a patent medicine. Coke was invented by a pharmacist in Atlanta, Georgia, and he originally sold Coke as a medicine, and as you probably know that the original formula for Coke had a very small amount of cocaine in it as a natural part of the cola bean. The Coke now doesn't have cocaine in it, but it did have a little bit at first, and cocaine was considered, medicine up until the 1920s, or I think maybe the early 30s. You could actually go to a drugstore and buy cocaine because it was used as a toothache medicine. So, but then of course they found out that people became addicted to it, and it was one of the first drugs to be restricted by law. Coke really became an international thing after World War II. American soldiers were given Coke as part of their rations when they were shipped to Japan or to Asia and Europe. And the Coca-Cola company became very savvy about marketing their drink, not just in the United States but overseas as well. And there were soft drinks before. Coke was in Europe before World War II. It was really after World War II that it became a hugely successful drink. In fact, Coke cut off the supply of the syrup for Coke to Nazi Germany in the 1930s before the United States entered the war. They cut off the supply, and so the Coca-Cola subsidiary in Germany came up with an alternative drink which was made from fruit juices and was called Fanta, and that, of course, is still around today. So Fanta actually originated in Nazi Germany, but it's still part of the Coke family. And so the last chapter is about basically globalization, how Coke became a multinational corporation and began selling its soft drink around the world. And you have kind of a homogenized product. Coke in the United States is exactly the same as Coke in all these other countries, much like globalization kind of smooths out regional differences and creates a universal product. So, as you can see, just going through these 6 drinks, we really have a worldwide global history of how human culture changed over time thanks to these half dozen beverages. So if you're interested in history, or you just like drinks, you may want to read this book. The book is A History of the World in 6 Glasses, and the author is Tom Standage. This has been another Man in Gray book review. Thanks for watching.